You're listening to Sweet Talk, all things maple. Hey Aaron, we're coming into the start of the maple season, which is an exciting and a busy time of the year. Are you kind of up and running and all set for the season?
We're getting there. We wait all year for this, but I think for everybody, it always ends up being a lot of last minute things that you need to hustle around and get ready. But we're about halfway tapped and we should be ready to roll as soon as the sap starts flowing. How about you?
We're getting there as well. That same thing. There's always those kinks you got to get out at the beginning of the season. We're probably 3/4 of the way tapped. We've had our first boil just the other day, so it's exciting. But certainly the warm weather came a little bit earlier than we hoped. But we're kind of up and going, and we're getting there, which brings up an important topic as we get into the maple season to think about quality of maple syrup.
Yeah, quality is a huge issue for maple syrup. And we definitely need to make a product that's safe and shelf stable. So that's the most important part, right?
Yeah, exactly. We as maple producers, we have that responsibility to produce something that it needs to be consumer safe. It's going to be shelf stable, but we also need to represent the maple industry with that consistent product.
So safe and shelf stable is important, but it's also important to have something that has good flavor, good appearance, and all the things that make our product attractive to consumers. If we have a consistently good quality product across the board from all the producers in our industry, then we can get that message out there and say, hey, look, we have a gourmet, high quality product, and that will help us get a premium price in the market and make our industry more profitable.
Yeah, so even if you're a producer with one tree or you're a producer with 100,000 trees, quality is an important aspect for production. We really wanted to incorporate that as this podcast comes out during the maple season. And so I reached out to Mark Isselhardt from the University of Vermont, who has a lot of experience working with maple producers, tasting a lot of different maple products, and judging a lot of maple syrup contests, and does the maple grading schools as well. And so I sat down with him to have a conversation on quality of maple syrup, grading maple syrup, and the different standards and how maple producers can produce a quality product.
Yeah, Mark is definitely a great authority on this. Let's have a listen.
My name is Mark Isselhardt. I'm the maple specialist with UVM Extension. I'm based out of the Proctor Maple Research Center. And my position really encompasses everything from the tree to the bottle, doing some research and outreach and education, primarily with maple producers, but really anyone interested in maple. And I have been doing that for about 5 years with Extension. And then I was with the Proctor Maple Research Center as a researcher before that for a long time.
Great. Welcome to Sweet Talk, Mark. It's great to have you here. Today I want to have a little bit of conversation about quality of syrup and why that's important. So, as sugar makers, we all think we make the best maple syrup, and it's good to have some pride in what you make, right? But, not all maple syrup is the best maple syrup that should go in the bottle. So I want to start out with, how would you define that word quality as it relates to maple syrup?
Sure. So there are clearly defined regulations as to what can be called pure maple syrup. And they refer to 4 standards: color, clarity, flavor, and density. And they're clearly written. The industry has moved towards a harmonized set of regulations. Before, it had been a bit of a patchwork. Different states and provinces had different names and even different standards for some of those 4 categories. But in order to be called grade A pure maple syrup, they have to meet the minimum standards in those 4 categories. And that's essentially not negotiable. If it doesn't meet the standard for one reason or the other, the producer has to identify that and mitigate it, either put that syrup that doesn't meet the standard in with something below, like processing grade, or have some other use for it, but it doesn't meet the standard. So that's pretty cut and dry, except that within those 4 standards of color, clarity, flavor, and density, some are quantitative and easily measured, and some are quite subjective. And so something like density, we have instrumentation to be able to measure the density of syrup. And with some precision, there are other things like flavor, which are fairly subjective. There are no instruments to be able to measure one flavor versus the other. And what has developed over time is sort of this practice of and general understanding of what meets the standard for flavor for those 4 grades. And then there are some defects that can become problematic. So it's a bit of a mix of science and art, where producers have the experience that's handed down or just hard-earned, personally hard-earned, trying to figure out what makes good flavor and what doesn't. Not every batch of syrup is going to taste terrific. And if you were entering a contest, not every syrup is going to win best in class. There's lots of syrup that's good, and some is really excellent, and some really doesn't meet that standard. And so it's really the producer's job to define and identify what they've made and to figure out which category it goes into. Color grading is sort of kind of an in-between. We do have some instruments and some color comparators that producers use with good success to be able to put syrup in the right categories. It's important to understand how those tools work and to use them appropriately. So you could have the right tool but not really know how it works, and you could have a mistake. But fundamentally, quality is good tasting, doesn't have a defect in terms of flavor or some other issue with density, color, or clarity. Really, it's the knowledge of the producer, whoever's name is on that retail container. It's their job to make sure that syrup meets the standard.
So why is it really important for maple producers to think about those quality aspects?
Well, one of the great things about the maple industry is there's a very low barrier to entry. You could tap, theoretically, one tree, make syrup, and even though it may not make economic sense to do that, you could potentially sell that syrup. And even if you don't sell that syrup, there's so much work involved and so much pride in making a good product that quality is tremendously important. Obviously, when you get to be a little bit bigger and you do start selling some of that syrup, you're now part of the maple industry. So a consumer may not know, may not really care how large your operation is. They're paying for a high quality product and they expect a good tasting, high quality product. So by joining that maple industry, by selling syrup, you have as much impact for that consumer as someone who has been doing it for generations and has invested so much of their life and money in the product. So there's a real responsibility to keep the quality of the product high for everyone involved in the maple industry. Maple is an expensive product. There are cheaper alternatives, and consumers will probably not buy your syrup again if they have a bad experience. And they may even impact their view of maple in general. So regardless of your scale, you're still responsible to make a high quality product and to put the best product possible on the marketplace. And we know that there are issues consistently when we go out and sample syrup in the marketplace. We know that there are issues, some more significant than others, but there's always more to learn. Even producers who've been doing it for 50 years, they care about quality. They're going to keep trying to improve on the product. So it's really important that everyone do the same.
Yeah, for sure. Great representation for the industry is important. You had mentioned before grading of that maple syrup. And as sugar makers, when we're trying to sell to consumers, it's, sometimes challenging or frustrating or confusing to sell syrup to consumers with the different grades because they don't always understand the grades. And so there's a lot of education that goes into selling maple syrup, right? So why is grading maple syrup important?
Right. Well, I mean, it kind of goes along with the idea of quality. A consumer goes into retail setting either through marketing or just personal understanding. They're going to buy what they want. And if they buy it and it doesn't meet what they expect, they're going to be disappointed. So if someone goes into a situation to buy very strong flavored dark syrup because they're going to be baking and they want the flavor to come through, if they open that container and use it and the finished product has no flavor, they're going to be disappointed. So you need to have a way so that the educated consumer has a consistent understanding of what they're buying. And maple is a small, we like to think it's very big and a huge industry, but it's quite small compared to other consumer products. And so there is a lot of education that's needed. And I think the consistency of the product and consumers understanding what they're going to get when they put their money down to buy that product is really important. There's kind of an interesting historical context too to maple, where the vast majority of the history of maple, it wasn't syrup actually that was produced, it was hard sugar. So if you go way back, we didn't have the ability to keep syrup essentially refrigerated. It could spoil over time, and boiling it to sugar density, hard sugar, was a way of preserving that product. But even back then, they knew that sap that would make a lighter grade syrup would make a more desirable product than sap that's been sitting around for a long time. So quality has always been important. There wasn't so much grading back then, but there was definitely an identification that the quality of the sap going in was going to impact the quality of the product coming out. And that early era, and this is colonial era, the market really demanded the lightest colored sugar possible. That's one of the reasons why we called it Vermont Fancy for so long, because the sap that would make that light colored syrup would crystallize in a way that was much more reminiscent of cane sugar, which at the time was the luxury product and something that really commanded a high price.
Yeah, and you think they probably didn't want everything tasting like maple too, right?
Right. It was seen as a more rustic and sort of inferior sweetener, whereas cane sugar with almost no flavor was really the luxury thing, it just seems so foreign today. But that period lasted for a fairly long time. And it wasn't until, I would say the latter half of the 19th century that we started seeing the ability to keep syrup fresh and in a container that could retain its quality. And it really wasn't until the early 1900s you really started seeing grading standards start to become possible. And what's interesting about that is that there's actually more value in syrup because you don't have to boil it as much. A sugar maker would get more volume for a given amount of sap that they had to boil than they would sugar because there's more water in that product. But at the same time, the quality becomes a bigger issue because there is a little bit more water in that. And that's really when you start seeing grading laws come on the books. The other interesting thing about grading laws is that there was a lot of adulteration going on. There were products on the marketplace in the early 1900s that had zero maple in them, but they were marketed as pure maple syrup. Some of the early FDA regulations about food and cosmetics regulation were initiated by the maple industry, saying that we are getting, there's all this fraudulent syrup in the marketplace and it needs to be regulated. So if you look back in that early history of grading, the maple industry had a big part to play. Some of the companies weren't so much in the Northeast, although there was some, but there were some companies out in the Midwest and elsewhere that were making huge amounts of pure Vermont maple syrup that really had very little maple in them at all.
Interesting.
So you see those grading laws start to develop. It becomes a marketing tool. It becomes a way of producers not getting undercut in the marketplace. But it was really that shift from hard sugar or granulated maple sugar that really was used more as something to cure tobacco or some other things. The bulk of maple that was produced in that era wasn't really being used at the consumer level as a sweetener. It was used by tobacco companies for curing tobacco or some other products. It wasn't until we started doing liquid syrup that these grading laws came into place and started to become enforced. And at the same time, it was a way for the industries to market themselves as this is a pure product. This is something different than that cane or corn syrup that's out there.
Yeah, I think it gives an opportunity to educate consumers on the kind of natural variation how that grade can change from day to day and throughout the season. I had a kind of a side thought when you mentioned the sugar and that with all the container issues we're having nowadays that maybe we should go back to just making more sugar that we can wrap up in paper or something instead.
Yeah. And it's always going to be a struggle, though. It's a very expensive thing to produce. So, it would take a fair amount of education of consumer to make sure that they saw the value compared to some of these cheaper sweeteners.
Certainly. Yeah, that's the downside to maple sugar, right, is that cost difference because it's even more expensive than maple syrup, right? That it's hard to compare that when you can buy a 4-pound bag of cane sugar at the grocery store for $4 or $5 now, right? And which is interesting because if you look back to like the 1800s, that's how much maple sugar cost was, like a dollar a pound, a couple bucks a pound, which is like the same exact price as what cane sugar is now.
It's amazing that those two curves, those two trends crossed.
Yeah, totally.
And it's also important to recognize that back in the day, one of the reasons there was a move to get away from cane sugar because of its association with slave labor. It was in the Northeast, it was an important rallying cry for abolitionists and folks saying, we can produce this here. We don't need to rely on these inhuman tactics to produce this sweetener. We can do it here. And that was on the radar of Thomas Jefferson. It was on the radar of many early Americans. So interesting part of history.
Yeah, I think Thomas Jefferson, didn't he did like a tour up through like Vermont and other parts of New England, kind of getting a feel for what could be the sugaring industry, right, in the United States.
Right. Yep. He even planted some sugar maples at Monticello too.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's pretty cool. So I want to talk about, you'd mentioned before density, and obviously the density of the maple syrup, is critically important for producing what we would call quality syrup, right? Because if you're not in that correct density, you're going to have spoilage issues.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So I mentioned that the industry has worked very hard over a long period of time to harmonize the standards. Unfortunately, this is one of those places where there isn't complete harmony. So the USDA regulations state that the minimum density of pure maple syrup is 66 Brix. Brix being a measure of sucrose concentration in a pure sucrose solution. And we know that there's other things in maple besides sucrose, but for practical purposes, it's a good measure of the sugar concentration. And so 66 is the minimum, 68.9 is the maximum. But in Vermont, we have 66.9 as the minimum Brix, and 68.9 is the upper limit. I haven't heard a great explanation about why that is, but I think it probably comes down to the scale that was used for a long time was the Baume scale, which is actually a function of a salt solution. It's not a sugar solution. And I think when you're using the Baume scale, they don't line up perfectly with Brix. So I think when you took the minimum standard for Baume and translated it over to Brix, I think that's where you get to that higher minimum. And it's an odd number. 66.9 is just an oddly precise number to have for your range. But it does have a higher density, and it does actually have a slightly different mouthfeel, and it does have more sugar for that volume. So the consumer does get a little bit more for it.
Yeah. In your opinion, as being in Vermont, should that standard drop down to 66 like most other states and provinces?
I don't think so. I think it's well established. It's been on the books long enough that I think you could make as good an argument that you should bring everyone else up to 66.9, but it's okay to have a little bit of discontinuity, I suppose, in the grading standards. What is important to note is that if you're below density, there are plenty of ways in which that can happen. Probably the most common would be folks not measuring the temperature of the syrup when they're using the hydrometer. Hydrometer is the most common instrument for measuring density. It's a glass vial, precisely weighted, has a graduated scale that helps you identify what the density is. It's an imperfect device. It is good enough in practice to get sugar makers in that range. But if you're not measuring the temperature of that syrup, but right before you put the hydrometer in, you're really just shooting in the dark. So that's one of the more common ways. Then the other one might be just not measuring what the water is boiling at on the day you're producing. That can fluctuate with barometric pressure. So if you end up with low density syrup, the syrup is more at risk for mold. It's more at risk for fermentation. It doesn't have the same mouthfeel. Even small differences in density right around that syrup range can have a big impact on how that tastes or how it pours. And consumers, they could pick up on that, especially if they're used to highly engineered, processed syrups like cane or corn syrup based sweeteners. Maple that's really at the bottom end or below the range is going to look really watery. So that's also not a good marketing thing.
I think we don't talk about that a lot, the kind of the mouthfeel in maple syrup, and that it is important for consumers that, if it is too runny, I think they don't like that as much, and it can vary between 66.0 and 68. There's a big difference in that mouthfeel.
It's not linear by any means. The viscosity changes dramatically within a very short range of density. So it can really make a difference. And of course, at the high end, if you go over for whatever reason, the syrup got too hot, or maybe it's in the canner and it got too hot at the last few containers, you can get crystallization. And that's frustrating to a consumer. It's really hard to get that sugar out of there, and it's a waste. A lot of times it'll just get thrown out.
Mm-hmm. Is there a perfect device for testing, to know your correct density for finished maple syrup?
No, there's no perfect device. I would say that if you're dealing with room temperature syrup or somewhere near room temperature, a refractometer, either a digital or an optical refractometer, is pretty darn good, assuming it's been calibrated. Refractometers don't like hot syrup, even if they say they're temperature compensated. They're really not designed for hot syrup, and definitely not intended for syrup right off the evaporator. So I would not recommend using those instruments right off the evaporator or right off the canner, I suppose. Hydrometer, it's a simple device. It does a good job. It's not a super precision instrument, though. If you look at the graduations on most hydrometers, it's a pretty coarse scale. So I think there can be a tendency to want to read between the lines, literally. It might be giving you a false sense of precision. So just make sure you're in that range. It's a 2 degree Brix range, which is pretty good. And understand that if you're really trying to get towards that low end, you got to be extra careful about making sure that you're right on with density. The idea of having moldy syrup is not great. You're definitely going to lose customers, and people probably won't come back. I think one thing about mold is important to note, that you can have moldy syrup in correct density syrup. There are some species of mold, water mold especially, which if they're in the environment and they get into that container, it is possible to have moldy syrup, even if you did everything right with density. So if producers find that they've had an issue with mold, probably a sanitation issue after the boiling in the evaporator. So they probably want to clean everything, try to get a sense of if there's a lot of air movement going on, if there's other things in that canning room that could potentially be causing that mold contamination.
So just one last thing I want to hit on density. I think a lot of the biggest challenge for getting the correct density is a lot of times for the smaller producers who aren't making very much and, may not even have enough to fill a cup of a hydrometer, right? And so, for that, best option is probably using a thermometer, right?
Yeah. Whenever you're finishing syrup, it's always a good idea to boil water, check it, where it's reading, and then make that adjustment, that 7.5 degrees above to get you to syrup density. Really small operations, I tend to recommend people boil to really close and then batch up. I know people want to get right to that finished syrup every time they boil, but it might make filtering and all these other things easier if they were to batch those bits of syrup together so they have a little bit more to work with.
True. All right. So, when we think about kind of this quality aspect, we talked about grading, which are, something that we can measure, right? We talked about density, which is something that we can measure. And then we kind of get into more of the flavor side of things, which you said is subjective, right? And so you've done a lot of working with a lot of maple producers, done a lot of judging of maple syrup. So you've, tasted a lot of maple syrup out there, and you also work with the maple grading school. And so what are some of the kind of common off flavors that you see out there in the industry?
Yeah, so sort of in practice, we've developed this idea that there's 2 big types of off flavors. There's what we call Mother Nature off flavors, which aren't necessarily a mistake that the producer made. It has more to do with the chemistry of the starting sap has changed in some way and will produce a particular flavor that doesn't meet the standard for pure maple syrup after boiling. And there are a variety of these. The most common would be buddy. All off flavors should be talked about sort of on a spectrum of intensity. So you can have mild, you can have medium, you can have very strong. And that's pretty subjective. Some people will be really put off by a very mild buddy. Other people won't even pick up on it at all. So that's challenging. But the most common off flavors would be buddy, which happens near the end of the season. It is not tied to some visible change in the dormant buds. A lot of folks may not realize that those winter buds are there all winter. We get a lot of calls, people saying my tree's all budded out. And I think sometimes it's just a little bit more paying attention to what the crown of the tree looks like that time of year. So you can have buddy off flavored syrup and not have any visible signs from the outside of the tree. What's important is that you either smell the steam from that sap that's being boiled or actually taste the finished product. You can't really taste sap and say this is going to make buddy. It really has to go through the process of boiling, or at least it's starting to evaporate before you can get that smell. So I'd say buddy, and some places will have it more often or more intense than others. The other one is metabolism. Metabolism is, we understand really well the chemistry of the flavor. It's a series of pyrazine compounds that are formed as a result of some amino acids and some other materials in the starting sap that once they get heated and combined with the other constituents of sap, we produce this, what we call metabolism. It's a common term. It's not a scientific term. And we know that those flavor compounds are volatile. You can boil them off and then dilute back to make a decent tasting syrup. But the physical or sort of environmental conditions that produce metabolism aren't really that well understood. We seem to associate it with very cold temperatures and then dramatic warm-ups during the first half of the season or the middle part of the season, but not always. So you might produce some metabolism off flavor and then it might go away again. So it's a little bit mysterious in that way, but we do know that it does happen. And then I would say the third most common off flavor is what we call sour sap. And you could argue that's a processing mistake, but essentially it's the sap has been degraded by microorganisms, which are everywhere in the environment. And if the environmental conditions are favorable, then they'll start to digest some of those sugars and you'll end up with kind of a sour taste.
Yeah, that kind of fermented taste, right?
Yeah.
How do you describe a metabolism taste?
Well, flavor is such a weird thing. That's one of the things that you struggle with, right? Because we all have different experiences with flavor, not just maple, but just flavor in general. We all have different abilities. I think the old days of saying some people have more taste buds than others and that's it, I think it's a little simplistic. I think that's part of it. There is an anatomical part. But then there's also just experience. If you have tasted hundreds of samples of maple syrup, you're going to have been exposed to a wider range of flavors than someone who's only tasted their own or maybe their neighbors. And then the lexicon, the words that we use to describe flavors are tricky. Some people just don't taste what people are saying it should taste like. So occasionally you'll hear like cardboardy sort of taste for metabolism. Some people will interchange buddy and metabolism. And some people will say, well, it's a very Tootsie Roll sort of flavor. Chocolatey is also used somewhat interchangeably with buddy and metabolism. So it's a challenge. It's a real challenge. This is definitely not a precision area of grading. There are some common terms that people use to discuss flavors, but it's by no means perfect science.
Yeah, it's very psychological too when it comes to flavor, right?
Yeah, one thing I really try to do is when we're doing either a training with producers or even if we're at a contest, I don't want to see anyone. I want to do my own thing and have my own experience and not be influenced by the person next to me, their head snapping back or like coughing or breathe, if they have a bad tasting syrup. Because if someone doesn't pick up on an off flavor, but there is clearly one there, they shouldn't feel bad about that. They should just acknowledge it and try to work to figure out a way to get more experience to kind of tease out those off flavors. Just ignoring if you can't taste it isn't going to do anyone any good, especially your own customers or the industry as a whole. So we always try to have people taste in groups, but maybe try not to be influenced by each other's reactions. Try to always taste at the same time under the same conditions.
Yeah, and it's good, I think, to taste other people's maple syrup, right? Get together with your neighbors and other, fellow sugar makers, right? And, see what their flavors are like, because sometimes you get used to your own and that's what you think it should taste like and not realize that other profiles that can be out there.
Yeah, and I think maple contests are really important. We've seen a bit of a drop off in participation in maple contests. I think you could probably make an argument that That's true of a lot of things, so I think people just aren't as into it as they once were. But I see maple contests as having two really important roles in the maple industry. One, if you put forward what you think is your best syrup and you win a ribbon, or maybe even you win best in class or best in show, that can have impact for your marketing. It's a point of pride. It shows you that you're doing everything right, and it's recognized for being exceptional. That's one thing. That's great. People love to win awards. Another way to approach a contest is to take randomly syrup off the shelf that you've packed and submit it, not knowing, not trying it beforehand. What you now have is a really cheap quality control instrument that you have unbiased people grading your syrup for the basics and giving you feedback. It's not your neighbor who likes to hang out at your sugar house on Friday nights telling you everything's great. It's not, your friend who knows that you just mortgaged your house to buy all this really expensive equipment and doesn't feel like he wants to tell you that maybe it doesn't taste quite as good as he was hoping. These are unbiased people who are just giving you the feedback on the basics and does it meet the standard. So I think producers, you should always enter a maple contest. I think it is the cheapest quality control out there, and it's a really good way to make sure that your product you're putting out there meets the standards.
Is there anything we can do as sugar makers to kind of offset if we identify that we made some syrup that's got metabolism, flavor, buddy syrup, or the sourness? Can we blend any of that? Is there anything we can do? Should we dump that maple syrup? What's the kind of the best practice?
Right. So it kind of depends. We did quite a bit of work at the Proctor Maple Research Center focused on metabolism. And I'd point people to mapleresearch.org and type in metabolism. You come up with a lot of our publications on that. And we did find that there was a fairly simple method of mitigating that off flavor. You boil it to a higher density, those compounds volatilize. You do make a darker product, and then you do have to dilute it back with pure water to get the correct density. But that can be effective in removing that flavor. We haven't really rigorously tested Buddy doing the same thing with Buddy, but in just observations, it doesn't seem to be as effective. There's a food safety aspect of it too. Depending on what the off flavor is, you really can't make a wholesome product out of something that's putrid or rancid. You really can't. And so I would be concerned about giving too much advice to people doing too much post-processing without really understanding the science and the chemistry of that. And that is to say that pure grade A table syrup, there might be a little bit more flexibility if you're talking about processing grade syrup that doesn't meet the standard of grade A and is really destined for another additive to another product. But as far as making syrup into grade A, that's really challenging because you are talking about this pure product, and the laws don't allow really any membrane or ion filtration to kind of change the chemistry. You really have to keep it just with what you have. Blending is tough. I think more often than not, people try blending out off flavors and they make a lot of kind of mediocre syrup rather than improving the flavor. There isn't a whole lot of flavor in maple that can hide off flavor. So you would end up taking a lot of decent tasting syrup and you could make something that doesn't even meet the standard by adding just a little bit of bad tasting syrup. So I'm not a fan of blending syrup to improve flavor. I think it should really just be put into the category of processing grade, and it still has some value. If you look at the prices right now, especially how much demand there is for pure maple, not just table grade syrup, but as an ingredient, I think the last time I checked, I think about 60% of the value of maple is in processing grade, and then the extra 40% if it's grade A. So there's still quite a bit of value in that processing grade syrup. So I would probably recommend folks not trying to do anything too crazy to blend it out. One thing I will say about moldy syrup is there used to be recommendations that if you see mold on your syrup, you can just heat it up, boil it, skim it off, and it's good to go. We do not recommend that anymore. There's just too much research. A lot of it was done at UMaine. Some of it was done at the Proctor Center back in the 70s and 80s. There's too much risk involved in folks ingesting the mycotoxins or anything that is a byproduct of that fungal contamination to really be able to recommend that folks can just heat it up and then skim it off and say it's good to go.
What's your thoughts on making, say, buddy syrup or sour syrup once you know it's going to make that, the season of good quality syrups over? Do you think it's viable or smart for sugar makers to continue making that? Or is it best to kind of, once you get in those off flavors, just to be done with the season?
I think it really depends on the individual business and where their cost of production is, maybe how sharp their pencil is. And if they've developed an operation that is profitable at a relatively low finished product value, then it might make sense to keep going. But it's really hard to generalize across the whole scale of the maple industry. I think there are small operations where it might actually make sense to produce some of this processing grade syrup if you have a market for it. And then there's some really large operations that you would think, well, they're so big, their cost of production must be super low, but you don't know the underlying financials and how much their operation is leveraged. So there might be some large operations where they should stop. They just are not going to be making enough value in that product. So unfortunately, it's a bit of a individual decision, I think. If folks are doing it as a hobby or a relatively small scale operation, it's a personal decision. How much time, how much effort do you want to put into making something that really isn't that great? And usually by the end of the season, folks are pretty ready to be done. It's a lot of work and you have a lot of pride in the product. So if you're producing something you're not really proud of, then it's probably time to stop.
Yeah, definitely. So by the time this episode airs, it'll be right around kind of getting to the start of sugaring season. So, what are some tips that you have, things that we can do to try to eliminate some of those flavor issues?
Yeah, some of the basics that just haven't changed in over 100 years, it's boil your sap as fast as you get it. Don't let it sit around. Folks really need to think about sap more like a perishable food like milk rather than some other like water that you maybe would be able to hold on to a little longer. Once the sap leaves the tree, it's no longer sterile and it's exposed to all the environmental contamination that exists, microscopic spores, fungal microorganisms, all those things really, if time and temperature allows, will multiply and produce poor quality sap. And like I said, you can't make a high quality product out of poor quality ingredients. So do everything right, try to keep everything as clean as possible. Pay attention to how, if you have a tubing system, how your tubing looks, how your releasers look, how your storage tanks look. Try to keep things as clean as possible, rinse them out as best possible. But you are fighting against microbiology. And so what you can get away with early in the season when air temperatures are cooler, you're not going to be able to get away with later in the season when things are warming up and these populations of microorganisms are multiplying exponentially. So, just cleanliness, some of the processing mistakes, some weird ones, people try to use detergents. We really don't want to use really any of that when we're cleaning our maple stuff. We want to use good, clean, hot water as best possible. If we are going to do some sort of very dilute solution of bleach, it's got to be rinsed really carefully, triple rinsed, and all those things really need to be paid attention to. But really, there's paying attention to what's coming out of the evaporator, tasting it. It's not even really an off flavor. It's just a catastrophic defect called ropey syrup. We didn't really talk about that, but that tends to happen at the end of the season when it gets really warm. It's not even syrup anymore. It becomes this like stringy, ropey material. You can't filter it. You can't boil it. That's a contamination, a bacterial contamination where these syrup actually gets digested and turns into these long, stringy material. It is possible to make good syrup after that if the weather conditions allow, but you have to clean everything. All the float boxes, all the elbows, everything needs to get drained and cleaned really well. And some people probably are done at the season at that point. They don't want to go through all that process. But that one really is a bummer when folks start making ropey syrup.
Are there any kind of common, mishaps, things that producers do that, or mistakes that give some off flavors?
Yeah, I think, what is the saying? That there are sugar makers who have burned their pans and they're liars. So we've all done it. It happens, something you're not paying attention or something clogs a elbow or something, and next thing you know, the pans have run dry and you've burned stuff up. So I think that's a common one. Maybe not quite as catastrophic as running totally dry, but maybe you get a little scorch, and it takes a lot of time. You got to pay a lot of attention to what's going on, and there's steam. It can be difficult to see those things happening. So just paying attention to the details is really important. I think that if people try something different, sometimes that can precipitate an off flavor. Say they find some random cleaner they think is food grade and they try that, and that can develop a chemical off flavor perhaps. You'll get odd ones from time to time, but the vast majority would be those Mother Nature off flavors where it's not really the fault of the producer that caused the off flavor, but the producer has to make sure that they're identifying and tasting every batch of syrup. And one thing I will say, when you're boiling syrup all day and you're just immersed in all that steam, that's probably the worst time to be objective about how that syrup tastes. I really recommend folks take a sample jar if they're filling barrels or containers. Set some of that aside and taste it some other time. Make sure that you're not exhausted, you're not saturated with all the smells in the sugar house. Maybe take multiple days worth of samples and taste them all at the same time at room temperature, just like a consumer would. That's going to give you the best chance at identifying something's not quite right with that batch and avoiding the mistake of putting it in a retail container.
Yeah, the flavor changes quite a bit from, if it's cold maple syrup, that's in a refrigerator versus room temperature versus coming straight off evaporator. That flavor profile can change quite a bit. So room temperature is probably the best for tasting, right?
Yeah, room temperature. Make sure you totally coat your mouth with it. Usually taking a second taste is a good idea too, because sometimes you might get an initial flavor, but then you go back for that second taste. Just be open to that it may not taste great. And, if you get a reaction right away, take a second, try it again, see if there is something there. Have other people taste. That's really important. Don't rely on just your own abilities to decide whether or not something meets a standard. As far as contests go, one mistake we see a lot is that people enter, and I don't think they ever looked at what was in that container. We've had, especially this past year, we had syrup that was 2 grades darker than they said it was in the grade they entered. Now, remember I mentioned that it's good quality control, so that actually gave them some feedback that was valuable. No one likes to be rejected, so it doesn't feel good to get your syrup rejected, but it's really important that if you're entering a contest, it doesn't have to be hot packed. It just has to meet the standard when the judges grade it. So if you're trying to win best in class or best in show, there's no reason why you can't open it, grade it right before you enter it, and make sure you're going into the right color class especially.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this is all really useful information, and I think this will be helpful for sugar makers. So I appreciate you being with us here today on Sweet Talk, Mark.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, Adam, and feel free, anyone who wants to reach out, if they have questions, I'm happy to share.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mark.
All right, take care, Adam.
So, Aaron, Mark brought up a lot of interesting points there that I think are really important for us to think about as maple producers, and especially as we think about the natural variation in maple syrup.
That natural variation creates some challenges, but as Mark pointed out, there are some practices that apply regardless of the variation that help us make good quality syrup. And some of the things that struck me that he highlighted were, first and foremost, learn to taste syrup, learn to understand flavor, and also learn how to properly grade your syrup, learn how to use your equipment, get the right density, get the right color grade, and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. He brought up some really key tips for doing that grading practice, which is really important. And the tasting aspect, I think that was really neat to hear about as well. And some of those tips that, not just tasting it when you're tired or when it's hot, letting it cool down, tasting syrup with friends, tasting other syrup, getting experience. The more you taste, the better your palate's going to be for detecting some of those off flavors.
Yeah, those are all great tips. And the one that I really like that Mark mentioned is saving the samples to taste later. And I think there are a couple of advantages to that. First and foremost, when you're in the sugar house working, You're not necessarily focused on flavor evaluation. There's too many other things happening to really focus on the flavor and quality of your syrup. But the other advantage of that is if you save multiple samples over time and then taste them all together, you have something to compare the flavor to. So that's a practice I haven't done at my sugar house, and I'm going to adopt that practice and see if it helps improve my flavor evaluation in the future.
Yeah, that's a good tip. So as we said, there's that natural variation in flavor. And so sometimes we will give up and think that, oh, that's just what it is. But there are things that we can do to control the flavor of maple syrup, right? And you're actually doing a lot of great research work into that. So do you want to highlight some of the research work that you've done or are about to do on kind of looking at maple syrup flavor and controlling flavor and quality?
Yeah, so in the past, we've really been bound to whatever conditions are happening in the sugar bush or in the environment to determine what grade and flavor of syrup we make. But some of those variables we can control. And so we're looking at which variables we can control and measure in order to make the grade and flavor that we want. And that includes things like measuring the invert sugar in sap, which is very easy to do with a diabetic meter, ultra-filtering the sap to remove microbes, controlling the temperature and the holding time, manipulating the dissolved oxygen levels, and all those things can be managed in a way to help create the flavor attributes and the color grade that we want. So that's something we're looking at very closely, and I'm hoping to have some more specific information and guidance available soon on that.
Yeah, it's exciting, and it'll be exciting to see that moving forward. And I know you've done some research even a couple years ago of looking at improving flavor by adding oxygen, right? And you had some exciting things that you found there, and that we're taking something we know is going to make a bad flavor, but can we make something that is still good or make something a little bit better that can be used for another product?
Yeah, that's an area where we can really expand our knowledge and what we do. The traditional method is the sap comes in, we collect it, and then we boil it as soon as we can, and we don't pay a lot of attention to the variables that we can change. So I think there's a lot of room for experimentation and perhaps changing some of those variables to really improve quality and have more control over the process. So our listeners can stay tuned, and I'll have more information available on that soon.
Yeah, that's exciting. I think that's a good place to leave it for today, to stay tuned for future episodes of Sweet Talk, and hopefully we'll be tackling those topics. So thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for joining us for Sweet Talk, all things maple with Aaron and Adam. Sweet Talk is produced by the Cornell Maple Program and is made possible from funding from the USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture. All music was obtained from Blue Dot Sessions. For more information on all things maple, visit cornellmaple.com. Join us next time for more Maple Sweet Talk. Have a sweet day.